Welcome to the Friday, June 28th episode of On Iowa Politics. This week, severe flooding in western Iowa, a carbon capture pipeline gets approval from Iowa regulators, and of course, the big Iowa Supreme Court ruling on abortion. Hello, everyone. I'm Erin Murphy, the Des Moines Bureau Chief for the Gazette in Cedar Rapids. With me this week are Gazette Deputy Bureau Chief Tom Barton. Good afternoon, Tom.
Hello, Erin.
Lead Des Moines Bureau Chief Caleb McCullough is with us. Hello, Caleb.
Good afternoon, Erin.
And Sarah Watson of the Quad City Times is also joining us. Hello, Sarah.
Greetings, Erin.
Let's kind of do this backwards wise as what a typical journalist would do, and let's bury the lead here. And first up this week, start with Summit Carbon Solutions being given the green light by the Iowa Utilities Board to build a carbon capture pipeline in Iowa with a few qualifications. The ruling is a momentous one in a years-long battle over the pipeline and a debate about property rights and public projects. And the IUB ruling was met with swift reaction from elected officials in Iowa. Caleb, tell us all about it.
Yeah, so this pipeline was approved by the Iowa Utilities Board this week. It is a pipeline proposed to cross 5 states, including Iowa, and about 680 miles in Iowa to store ethanol, carbon dioxide emitted at ethanol plants underground to take advantage of tax credits and lower the carbon footprint of ethanol to allow it to be sold in other markets that it's not currently taking advantage of right now. To accomplish that, the pipeline company Summit Carbon Solutions asked to use eminent domain. That gives them the right to take land from landowners along the route that don't want to sell the land to them, so that they can build the pipeline. So that's been kind of the main controversy with this is, that eminent domain is used for things like highways and utilities. But the people who oppose this pipeline argue that the pipeline as a project of a private company that is only being used by private companies and the profits are going to the coffers of private companies. They argue that that's not a valid use of eminent domain and that it shouldn't have been approved. But the State Utilities Board, on the other hand, said that it was eminent domain is warranted and valid under the law for a project like this. And so they gave that approval. So that is the first step for this pipeline to be built. It's the first major state approval that it's approved or that it's received. And it still has to get approval in North Dakota, South Dakota, Minnesota, Nebraska. And that's it. Had to go count real quick. And so, yeah, the order allows gives the pipeline the right of eminent domain, but it also says that it needs to receive approval in both South Dakota and North Dakota before beginning construction. So North Dakota is where the reservoir is going to be and where the CO2 will be deposited. So if they don't get approval there, there's really no reason for the pipeline to be built. And that was kind of the IUB's rationale there. And then, so the response from the opponents on this week was state Iowa lawmakers, Republicans and Democrats have both supported restrictions on the project, specifically citing property rights and the use of eminent domain. So House Speaker Pat Grassley said that it is time and that he called for reviewing the state's eminent domain laws. The way he kind of worded it seemed a little more broad than what they've done in the past, kind of specifically looking at carbon pipelines. But of course, he didn't name any specific policies, but he called for a review of the state's eminent domain laws. Representative Charlie Thompson, who was involved in the law that was passed, or the bill that was passed by the House this year, but didn't get signed into law, he kind of made a similar statement and said, there needs to be more action and more forceful action from state lawmakers. So unclear, where that's going to go. The Senate, as I think we've talked about on this podcast before, has never been very friendly to any sort of these regulations. So without any change in their tune, I don't see how any of that's going to happen anyway. But I'm sure it'll come up January of 2025.
Yeah. And to that reaction, Caleb, I was struck by how, and you mentioned how it was Democrats and Republicans, and just how much of it there was. And I don't know. I mean, I was aware, obviously, of people and lawmakers who have been opposed, or not even necessarily opposed to the project, but concerned about the use of eminent domain for it. And but boy, I just thought the responses were even more sweeping than I thought, and it was also kind of interesting to see all of those that were critical or upset with the IUB decision, and not a whole lot of yay type of press releases that came out
Yes.
on whatever day that was. Now, forgive me
Mhm.
for not being
Yeah,
able to understand time at this point, Friday afternoon.
right. No, the date also slipped my mind. Maybe Wednesday. That sounds right. But yeah, the only, I mean, the positive comments came from the Iowa Renewable Fuels Association, which of course stands to gain from this and has economic financial interest in the project. Governor Reynolds didn't say anything publicly. She has been generally supportive of carbon capture pipelines and just the projects, and said that they're going to be helpful for Iowa's agriculture industry, but also says that has said that they need to be balanced with property rights, but has said that she's okay with the eminent domain laws that are on the book. So we didn't see a public statement from her this week.
Just gonna ask that. I didn't remember seeing one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The ones who the people who haven't been, separate from the Renewable Fuels Association has been a very prominent out there supporter of the pipeline. The people who haven't been prominent supporters but also haven't been prominent opponents didn't really say much this week.
Yeah, and like you said, it'll be interesting now to see what happens next legislative session. Although to a certain point, has the train left the station, so to speak, with this one now. I don't know. We'll see. It'll be interesting. And as to Governor Reynolds, we'll just have to ask her for her reaction at her next press conference. Also this week, Iowans from across the state, but especially in western Iowa, have been dealing with severe flooding. Caleb, sorry to lean on you earlier here, but you reported on the flooding in the state's response efforts. So get us started on this one too. And we'd go to our guy in western Iowa, Jared McNett of the Sioux City Journal, but he can't be with us this week. So Caleb, do your best, Jared, substitution and fill us in.
Yeah, Jared would be a much better correspondent for this section. So I'm sorry, Jared, if I don't do the region justice. But as you said, this flooding has been came this week over the last weekend. Really started in the most northwest corner of the state, in Rock Valley area around Sioux County. The city of Rock Valley was pretty heavily flooded. It had to be evacuated. Several other cities over the week have also been evacuated. I know of at least two reports of deaths in Iowa, unfortunately, from the flooding. I think somebody's truck had been swept into the river, and the details of everything I'm not super familiar with. But so that's just kind of a illustration of, I guess, the damage and the force of this flooding. Governor Reynolds requested a federal disaster declaration, and it got approved by President Biden. And so that opens up federal funding for recovery and public assistance to those areas. I think in that declaration, and this was just on Sunday, so it's now been 4 or 5 days later, but there were at least 1,900 homes that had been at least affected, damaged by the flooding. Hundreds that would have been totally destroyed. Wastewater systems, sewage systems had been totally wiped out. So people were left without running water, without sewage. Power obviously got destroyed. And so, yeah, that's been making its way now down the border. It hit Sioux City. It's now, there's flooding coming in Council Bluffs as well. So it's just been very, very widespread damage across the whole border, and even further in, I think, as from rain and as that's happened. And yeah, the stories of people, losing their homes or needing, emergency help has been really, really moving, I guess. A story that Kelly Garcia, the Health and Human Services director, told during a press conference on Sunday, just kind of trying to illustrate the coordination of the state response. Her office had received a call that there was a family that had to shelter in place, couldn't leave their house, but they had run out of seizure medication and insulin, which is obviously very time-sensitive, life-saving medication. They needed somebody to deliver that to them. And so the department called the Iowa State Patrol, which had been kind of driving around the state doing stuff like that, to try to find, a pharmacist that could dispense the medication. And the pharmacist in the town was on Main Street sandbagging to stop the flooding. So just kind of everybody working and pitching in there. And then, that pharmacist was able to dispense the medication. The state troopers drove into the house and was able to get it to those people in time. So yeah, things like that were happening all across the region this week. And it has been a very widespread issue.
Yeah, pretty harrowing thing. I mean, we're at the point where like we've got both state and federal disaster declarations, and even an expedited like emergency federal declaration. And Governor Reynolds has been going around the state, to visited some of these towns with FEMA earlier this week. So pretty intense stuff. Sarah, I wanted to ask you really quick, because this has been very focused to Western Iowa, right? And I know Davenport has some flooding history, including recently, but no issues on your side of the state, correct?
So we are actually expecting to hit
Okay.
major flood stage by about the 4th of July
Yeah.
at the Mississippi River. So that's about 18 feet at the Rock Island gauge, which is about 4 feet, 4.5 feet under the record that was set in 2019. So really the impacts are minimal. I mean, obviously in Western Iowa, there are some places that were multiple feet above previous records. So that's obviously very devastating. The flooding here is, we're going to experience many fewer impacts. It's pretty much going to, in Davenport, it'll close roads, and they had to cancel the like fireworks event because the barges can't anchor safely because the current is too fast. That's about all. The cities are getting ready for floods. They're handing out sandbags. They're setting up any temporary flood barriers, and there will be some impacts probably on homes along the riverfront, but nothing like you're seeing in Western Iowa.
Yeah, and forgive me, maybe I don't even know if you know the answer to this, Sarah, or forgive me if it's a stupid question, but I'm curious about that. Is it just because were the storms, is the flooding worse on the Missouri River than it is on the Mississippi, or is there better infrastructure in Eastern Iowa than there is in Western? Do you know why?
I think, well, I mean, flooding is always caused by the amount of rain or snow melts that's above you, that's north of you. And so I don't really know all the specifics of the Western Iowa situation, but I assume that there was just, torrential, heavy rainfall north of where that was at. And that's just, all the tributaries flooding into those rivers. I mean, this is unprecedented flooding, right? It's like feet above records.
Right.
So in Eastern Iowa, it's not as bad. Like there was pretty heavy rains in Minnesota and Wisconsin. And so those tributaries are feeding into the Mississippi River and causing flooding here. But yeah, so I think that's the main difference. I mean, if we had, the record for here was like 22.7 feet set in 2019. I mean, if we had a 27-foot flood, like 5 feet above the record, I mean, the officials have said, like, we're not sure exactly what would happen because that would be an unprecedented flood. Like they can guess, they've got models and things, but
Right.
there would be probably impacts that would be unexpected just because that's never happened before. So
Yeah. Okay. All right. Interesting. And yeah, like Caleb shared, inspiring tales and some harrowing incidents too. It's incredible stuff, and hopefully everyone is okay now, and now those communities work to recover. All right, so now let's get to the Across 1A all caps headline here. We held off recording this episode just to have this news included, so we're sitting here at about 4 o'clock now, Friday afternoon. And earlier today, the Iowa Supreme Court ordered the district court to dissolve the injunction that had been holding up the state's 6-week abortion ban. And so what that effectively means is that in a few weeks, that ban goes on the books and will be Iowa law. So after a few weeks of legal procedure here, that will become law, and abortions in Iowa will be effectively banned at roughly 6 weeks of pregnancy, which is often before the woman knows that she's pregnant. So what clinics and physicians have said is that effectively bans vast majority of abortions in the state. So we've been working throughout the day to cover that story. Tom, let me start with you. I don't think the ruling surprised anyone. So, what were maybe something? Just maybe pick something that stood out to you today, whether it was something that the justices said in their ruling, or something that an advocate said in their reaction, anything along those lines. There's been a lot of that kind of stuff all happening today. What has stood out to you?
Yeah, so I think the biggest thing that stood out was the dissenting opinion from Chief Justice Susan Christensen. It was a blistering dissent for a Supreme Court justice. Just to kind of catch people up who might not be familiar with kind of the background or the ruling that came out today. So a divided Iowa Supreme Court ruled 4-3 Friday to remove an injunction blocking enforcement of a strict abortion restriction, the so-called fetal heartbeat bill. As you mentioned, the ruling clears the way for that Iowa law to take effect that bans abortions after doctors detect cardiac activity in an embryo or fetus, which, as you mentioned, can be as early as 6 weeks into pregnancy, when most people, probably don't realize that they're pregnant. It's important to stress, though, that for now, abortion remains illegal in Iowa up to 20 weeks as the case gets sent back to the lower court to dissolve the temporary injunction while the lawsuit challenging the ban proceeds. And we've been told by attorneys for the ACLU and Planned Parenthood that under Iowa court rules, it will take at least 21 days for the case to go back to the district court. And so, again, abortion will remain legal during that time. A bit of context, this decision is a result of a years-long legal battle and makes Iowa the latest state to significantly restrict the procedure after the federal right to an abortion was overturned by the U.S. Supreme Court 2 years ago in 2022 with their Dobbs decision, which overturned Roe versus Wade. But getting back to your question, Chief Justice Susan Christensen was joined by two other justices on the court issuing a dissenting opinion, and it was pretty scathing. She wrote that the majority decision strips Iowa women of their bodily autonomy, that the law's exceptions are too narrow to protect women's health, and that Iowa should have kept its prior legal standard banning abortion restrictions that impose an undue burden on pregnant women. She said, I cannot stand by this decision. She said the majority's, quote, rigid approach relies heavily on the male-dominated history and tradition of the 1800s, all while ignoring how far women's rights have come since the Civil War era. She talked about how, women are human beings in their own right, worthy of the same freedoms and protections as men, yet women have not consistently possessed the same collection of rights granted to them throughout Iowa's history. She went on to say that the question is not whether abortion, with the polarizing reactions it evokes, is a fundamental right, but rather whether individuals have the fundamental right to make medical decisions affecting their health and bodily integrity in partnership with their healthcare provider, free from government interference. As I mentioned, she talked about or wrote that the law's exceptions for rape, incest, and medical or fetal abnormalities in medical emergencies to save the life and health of the mother are unattainable for many women and girls the way that the law applies them, and says that these exceptions prioritizes the unborn over the living, placing pregnant women in harm in the process, and talks about how she says, quote, the only female lives that this statute treats with any meaningful regard and dignity are the unborn lives of female fetuses.
That one stood out to me too. That line.
I mean, for people who are familiar with the court, follow their rulings and opinions and the dissents. I mean, for a dissenting opinion from this court and these justices, I mean, that's pretty. I don't know, seem pretty damning. I mean, it's language that you don't necessarily see from these justices. And then I'll just wrap up really quickly. She talks about how the law forces pregnant women and young girls, to what she says, to endure and suffer through life-altering health complications that range from severe sepsis requiring limb amputation to a hysterectomy, so long as those women are not at death's door. She goes on to say that, all in the name of promoting unborn life. And this was kind of her closing, which really stood out to me as well as, other observers. She says, nothing promotes life like a forced hysterectomy, preventing a woman from ever becoming pregnant again because she could not terminate a doomed pregnancy under the medical emergency exception.
Yeah, that you that's remarkable too. You said it exactly right, Tom. For most y'all who listen regularly to a Iowa politics podcast, you probably know this, but in case there's some casual listeners on here, that, like Tom said, that kind of language in a dissent, every once in a while there's a scathing dissent, so it doesn't never happen, but that's pretty exceptional language there in a dissent, and then from the Chief Justice on top of it.
Well, the other thing that kind of makes it somewhat surprising is last year, when you had a split decision, with a split 3-3 Supreme Court that deadlocked on whether or not to approve a petition from Republican Governor Kim Reynolds to reinstate a nearly identical law that passed in 2018 before the Iowa and U.S. Supreme Courts overturned the right to an abortion. Chief Justice Susan Christensen declined to kind of really weigh in on the debate. And so, it kind of left people maybe guessing a little bit as to maybe where she stood on the issue. And because, she didn't weigh in on this debate last year, I think it was maybe a little bit surprising for some observers, for some people to see just such a forceful dissent from the Chief Justice.
Yeah, absolutely.
I also think it's interesting to see that forceful dissent, given that all, and from her and from, of course, the other dissenting justices, given that all 7 of these justices were appointed by Republicans. I am fairly certain that Christensen was appointed by Reynolds. And
correct.
So,
yep.
Okay,
yep.
There you go. And so the fact that, if you look at the Dobbs decision, the only dissenters were the Democratic appointed justices. So just the fact that this stark of a difference in opinion and in defense of abortion rights was, by Republican appointed justices was interesting.
Yeah. So just so Reynolds appointed all but 2 of the justices serving on the court. Justices Waterman and Mansfield, who joined Chief Justice Susan Christensen in her dissent, were appointed by Reynolds' predecessor, former Republican former Governor Terry Branstad.
Yep.
I have a question. I have not been obviously following this as closely as you guys have. There was a justice that recused themselves from the 3-3 decision. Why did they not recuse themselves from this one? Do you know?
That's a great question. I do know that, and Caleb and Tom fact checked me along the way here. But it was Justice Oxley. The first name is escaping me. It's terrible.
Dana,
thank you. Dana Oxley, and she recused herself the first time because she had been doing some legal work for one of the parties involved in the case. And if I remember right, it was the clinic. Is that right?
Yeah, she
yes.
used to work for the firm that was defending the Emma Goldman Clinic. Yep.
Thank you. And she did not. So she recused herself from that one. And as I understand it, she did not recuse herself this time because by the time this particular lawsuit started the legal process, she had completed her work with that firm on behalf of the Emma Goldman Clinic. So she felt, I guess, whatever that word is, separated from it at that point. And so that was an interesting one. So I haven't checked this, Tom. I assume, because you've been driving the bus on this story, I assume the 3-3 voted the same way as they did last year, and then Oxley was the 4th vote to create the majority this time. Is that accurate?
Correct. Yep. She provided the tie-breaking vote.
Yeah. So that's kind of fascinating from a legal standpoint. One of the things that has already stood out, I'll just toss into this to me today, is just kind of a reminder So I was stationed at the Capitol this morning, where advocacy groups on either side of this were making themselves available to talk to reporters as the ruling came in. Look, I'm not telling anybody whether to agree with one thing or the other, or how to feel about one thing or the other, but just as a reminder that how powerful this topic still is after all these years. These two people, these two women, Maggie DeWitty on behalf of Pulse Life Advocates, which is a pro-life anti-abortion organization, and Dr. And forgive me if I'm pronouncing this last name wrong. I know how to spell it. Bevers, who is a co-founder of Iowans for Health Liberty, which is, and she's an OBGYN, and she's an advocate for abortion access. Both of these people, when speaking to reporters at one point, were speaking through tears. They were so emotional about the way the ruling went, and that kind of stood out to me, to see both of them moved to that level as they discuss this ruling from opposite sides of it. Again, just kind of serves as that reminder. Caleb, put you on the spot here. I didn't prep you for this question, so I apologize. This is obviously not a one-day story. What are you kind of watching for? And we've kind of already started talking about this a little bit. There's going to be reporting work to do in the future here. What's kind of some of the tentacles, so to speak, of this that you think is going to be interesting to watch?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I was just thinking about is whether the Republican majority in the state house is going to come back and try to further restrict the procedure. Obviously, anti-abortion advocates want the state to pass a law that bans all abortions from the moment of conception. Maybe with some exceptions for medical emergencies. We've seen that in the North and South Dakota, in Missouri, some of those strictest laws in the state, in the country. And so, there are definitely going to be people in the legislature that want that to happen. And, we'll see if there's enough support for those things. So yeah, that's definitely one of the big things that I'm thinking about.
Yeah. Tom, how about you?
Yeah, to build off of what Caleb talked about, I also wonder, because this is going to be a huge election issue going into the November election. Not just here in Iowa, but nationally. It's a big discussion and conversation. Democrats, are absolutely running on this issue of protecting abortion access and access to reproductive health and reproductive health rights. And, in that conversation, they bring up in vitro fertilization and how laws that are being passed by Republicans in these, red states potentially jeopardize that fertility treatment. And Republicans keep, pushing back on that, saying like, no, we don't want to jeopardize fertility treatment. So I also wonder if we might see some sort of legislation next session from Republicans related to that. I mean, we've seen the effort on the national stage in Congress with, members of Iowa's Republican congressional delegation putting forward different pieces of legislation meant to protect access to IVF. And Governor Reynolds, I think it's worth noting, in the statement that she put out applauding the court's decision, talked about state officials will continue to develop policies that encourage strong families, which includes promoting adoption as well as protecting in vitro fertilization. So I wonder if we could see something there next session related to IVF. To follow up on your question, Erin, other interesting angles out of this are going to be the impact that this is going to have on healthcare in Iowa writ large. Because we hear from physicians and OBGYNs about how this is going to impact their ability to recruit and retain physicians in Iowa, specifically OBGYNs, at a time when Iowa is among the worst states for.
I was just going to say, if the baseline is already low, we're already
right
in a bad spot.
Right. And so is this going to worsen Iowa's already weak system of prenatal and maternal health care We already have so many maternity care deserts. Is that just going to be exacerbated right now? In a specific, local angle to that, especially for us here at the Gazette, is what impact is this going to have for the University of Iowa's OBGYN residency program and its ability to maintain accreditation if they're going to be restricted in, their ability to perform the full scope, I guess, of care that's, required as part of their profession. I mean, is that residency program now in jeopardy potentially because of this legislation? And we've seen in other states, I guess most notably Idaho, where providers have left that state. There's been kind of an exodus there because of the strict abortion restrictions that they've passed. And then just to wrap it up, I mean, two other angles also that are going to be interesting to follow up with is so once this law does take effect, how do women and girls in Iowa then obtain an abortion if they need one? How do they still get access to that care? And, what are going to be the barriers for them? What resources are going to be available and provided to them? And then what kind of ripple effects or ramifications will this have on surrounding states, the states surrounding Iowa where abortion is still legal? We've gotten statements today from the Abortion Access Fund in Chicago, saying that already because of, similar laws being passed in other states, a lot of people are already, kind of flooding to Illinois to get abortions. And as a result, it's placing enormous strain on the providers in Illinois as well as Minnesota in both those states as well. It's creating a long wait time for people to be able to get those procedures.
Yep, that'll be. And I was just gonna say, and you noted, I believe on the it was on the ACLU Planned Parenthood call where they talked about Minnesota, and they already have both Dakotas that have stricter abortion laws in place, and then Nebraska and now Iowa. Yeah, that's an interesting thread to follow. Sarah, and I pass respectfully if you'd like, but you kind of the way you said it earlier, I like it. Like you're a little bit on the outside watching, and this not as knee deep in as the rest of us are, but also that can bring a unique perspective sometimes. And perfect example with the Oxley question, which was a great one. Is there either anything you've seen or heard today that's stood out to you, or maybe there's a question you still have unanswered as you wait to dive deep into that Gazette lead bureau story that's about to pop?
Yeah, I'm excited. I'm excited to dive into that. I guess one question I did have was, are doctors allowed to provide like referrals to people out, like to go out of state for an abortion?
Yeah,
As of now.
there's nothing in the law that precludes that, and that was one of the things. That is a good question. That was one of the things that was talked about as well on that in that Planned Parenthood virtual news conference, is how they've kind of been preparing for this and for that exact thing, and they've already been helping in other states along those lines, and they talked about having navigators in place for just that kind of thing. So presumably that's something they will. In fact, they said that they've already been doing that in Iowa, just because how much this has been in the news, that it has created the appearance or effect of some women believing that these restrictions were already in place. And so they said they've actually already been doing that with Iowa women, and obviously expect to more so in the future.
And I think just, you're talking about like angles to watch and like things to keep an eye on. I think too, just like long-term keeping track of statistics of, how many babies are being born in Iowa. Are we going to see an increase? Are we going to see a decrease? Are we going to see more infant deaths? Are we going to see more rise in, maternity complications for women who are carrying pregnancies? So I think all of those statistics, I think, really need to be closely watched to see what kind of impact this is going to have on this state.
Absolutely. I had the same thought. Like, there's kind of a population aspect to this. Are more babies born in Iowa, and then but then also, is there more migration or presumably the prevailing thought would be out of Iowa by women who don't want to live in a state with this kind of policy. We hear about that, and you hear about it anecdotally, but will that have an effect? And again, on a state that's starting with not the healthiest baseline in the world, where Iowa's very much struggled to grow its population, especially relative to other states, even in the Midwest. So yeah.
Also. Yeah, and then being in the Quad Cities, we're a border community with Illinois, so but we don't have like a clinic here. I think the closest one now would be in Peoria, so to the Quad Cities. So Mississippi River towns. And
so that's interesting. So there's not any on the Illinois side in the Quad Cities, even, huh?
Not right now. Not that I know of. And I mean, obviously, I think hospitals probably have the capability, in emergencies and things, but and there are, birthing centers here in the Quad Cities. But no, there's no like Planned Parenthood clinic. I think there was one in Bettendorf, but it closed several years ago.
Iowa City's pretty close, right? It's like an hour drive.
Yeah. So once the law takes effect.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Didn't even think about that.
Yeah, there's a lot of impacts to follow as this is implemented, and the effects are felt for weeks, months, years, and we've seen some of that in other states that have already passed laws like this. So we have a little bit of a hint of what could possibly come in Iowa. It'll be interesting to track. Keep reading your Gazette and Lee newspapers, because we'll have all the information on what's the latest. And as we said, Tom pointed out that technically for a few more weeks, abortion is still legal through 20 weeks. That is going to change soon. That there's no ripcord here on that at this point, but it just because of legal procedures, which is kind of interesting. I didn't realize that it'll take a few weeks for the law to actually, the injunction to actually be lifted and the law to go into effect, and your local newspaper will keep you filled in on that, and check them out anyways, man. I mean, this was a newsworthy day and a lot to talk about, and so we squeezed out of this week's podcast some really interesting stories and really interesting coverage from this past week, starting with also this morning. Caleb was in the federal courthouse covering a hearing on the lawsuit over the hemp regulations that were just passed, and we have talked about that topic a little bit in recent podcasts, but we had your arguments today that would have been great to talk about. Yeah,
your prediction of confusing math was accurate, and both the judge and the lawyer for the state and the lawyer for the plaintiffs were all getting confused about serving sizes versus milligrams. It was a great time.
Fantastic. Well, I mean, I kind of feel a little better now. Like I'm not the idiot that couldn't figure it out. Nobody can. Good. All right. There you go. How about that? And then Tom had some great ones earlier this week. The whole child labor law and some fines coming down on some Iowa restaurants. Some really fascinating stuff going on there. And we honestly don't usually talk a whole lot about the presidential debates because you can get all those hot takes from the National Press Corps. You don't need it from us. The candidates aren't coming here anyways. But even before that, Tom had a very interesting story on some comments that Congresswoman Marionette Miller Meeks made on Fox News about President Joe Biden and his his health. And anyways, check out that story too. Long-winded way of saying there's some other great stuff that we didn't have time for on the podcast this week that we definitely want you to check out. So if you're not already, please subscribe to us here on your streaming service of choice or on YouTube again, where you should smash that like button. And you can find the podcast also each week on your preferred Gazette or Lee newspaper website. And now you listen to the On Iowa Politics podcast. Make sure you're also subscribed to the On Iowa Politics newsletter, where every morning in your inbox, except the weekends, you'll receive all the latest politics and government coverage from our team. Everybody deserves a break on the weekend. You can subscribe to that free newsletter at the Gazette's website, thegazette.com. And lastly, as I mentioned, these stories and more, don't forget that the work of everyone you heard here today we found on the pages and websites of the Quad City Times, Muscatine Journal, Cedar Rapids Gazette, Waterloo Cedar Falls Courier, Mason City Globe Gazette, and the Council Bluffs Daily Nonpareil, and the Sioux City Journal. Spotlight by Chai Songwriter featuring Alicia Monet is playing us out this week. If you know an Iowa band and musician who should be featured on the podcast, please send us a sound file. For Tom Barton, Caleb McCullough, Sarah Watson, and our producer Bailey.cichon, I'm Erin Murphy. Thanks for for joining us.
We let 'em stare at us.